There was a time when humanity stood at the very edge of existence. Our numbers had dwindled to a fragile few, scattered across harsh landscapes of ice, fire, and famine. Survival was never certain. Every dawn was a gamble, every night a test of endurance. Yet from this crucible of suffering came resilience, ingenuity, and the seeds of imagination. We learned to cooperate, to innovate, to tell stories that carried hope through the darkness. The echoes of those near losses remain in our blood, in our myths, and in the scars of the earth itself. This is the story of that age, when the future of humanity balanced on a knife's edge. It is a story not of triumph alone, but of fragility, persistence, and the narrow escape from silence. To understand who we are, we must return to that time when humanity nearly vanished and listen to the voices of those who endured. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The long winter began with silence. Across the world, temperatures fell, and the seasons changed in ways no generation had ever known. Winds howled across empty plains, where forests once stood. Vast walls of ice crept steadily south, grinding mountains to dust, swallowing valleys, and reshaping entire continents. The earth had entered one of the coldest periods in its history, and humanity, fragile and few, stood upon the edge of survival. The air itself was sharper, thinner, carrying the weight of endless frost. Herds of great beasts wandered across frozen grasslands, woolly mammoths and bison with coats thick enough to withstand the brutal chill. Yet even they struggled to find food beneath the crusted snow. Saber-toothed cats and dire wolves prowled the edges of these herds, predators sharpened by hunger. For humans, who lacked the teeth and claws of beasts, who had only fire, stone, and each other, the challenge was far greater. Our ancestors lived in small bands scattered across harsh landscapes. They huddled in caves or fragile shelters built from bones, hides, and branches. Fire was their constant companion, their shield against the cold and the night. But fire alone could not always keep hunger away. Each day brought risk. Each hunt meant the possibility of death. Every misstep could mean the end of an entire family line. Archaeologists tell us that during this time the human population shrank to a frightening low. Perhaps no more than a few thousand breeding individuals remained. That number is small enough to fit within a single modern sports arena. One great storm, one famine, one outbreak of disease, and the human story might have ended there, a brief experiment lost to time. Yet those few endured. They endured because they adapted, because they learned, because even on the coldest nights, they carried within them a spark no ice could extinguish. The land they walked upon was unrecognizable to us today. Glaciers stretched from the poles deep into the continents, locking away vast oceans of water. Sea levels fell, exposing land bridges where none exist now. Winds swept across endless tundra, carrying dust so thick it coated the lungs of animals and people alike. The world was hostile, indifferent, vast beyond imagination. Yet in this vastness, small figures moved, clad in stitched hides, carrying spears tipped with flint. They were us, though we would hardly recognize them. Their survival depended on memory, on passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Where the herds moved, which plants could be eaten, which caves provided shelter from the storms, they lived in rhythm with a world that offered little mercy. Children were born into hunger and cold, and too many did not live to see adulthood. Yet each new life carried the hope that humanity would endure another season. This was the age when the long winter tested everything that made us human. The strength of our bodies, the sharpness of our minds, the bonds between us. We were few, we were fragile. And yet, against all odds, we endured. From that endurance, a new chapter of our story began, one written not on stone or parchment, but in the persistence of breath against the cold air, in the footprints pressed into snow, in the fragile firelight of a species refusing to vanish. Humanity has never been closer to disappearance than in this age of ice. Our numbers shrank to a fragile few, scattered across continents like sparks struggling to remain lit in a storm. Genetic evidence suggests that perhaps no more than 10,000 breeding individuals walked the earth. Imagine it, the entire fate of our species carried in so few bodies, each life balancing on the edge of extinction. They lived in small bands, rarely more than a few dozen souls bound together by blood and necessity. These groups moved cautiously through frozen valleys, across wind-blasted plains, and along coasts where the sea sometimes offered what the land withheld. Each step forward demanded risk. A wrong turn into barren ground could mean starvation. A failed hunt could bring death, not just to one hunter but to everyone who depended on him. Food was scarce, and hunger was constant. Bones from this time show signs of malnutrition, of children who never grew tall, of adults worn down long before their years. To survive, people learned to eat whatever could be found. Marrow cracked from bones, roots dug from frozen soil, fish caught with sharpened bone hooks. The great herds provided meat, hides, and bone, but bringing down such giants required skill, courage, and cooperation that no single person could achieve alone. Predators stalked the same prey, and sometimes the humans themselves. Saber-toothed cats, packs of dire wolves, even bears larger than any alive today roamed the same icy world. Humans had no claws, no fangs, no natural armor. Their defenses were unity, fire, and tools shaped with patient hands. Spears tipped with flint and obsidian turned weakness into advantage. Firelight kept the darkness at bay and gave them a weapon no predator could master. Yet the cold remained the greatest enemy. Shelter was fragile, built from hides stretched across wooden frames, or in places where trees were scarce, from the bones of mammoths lashed together. Within these makeshift walls, families huddled close, the heat of their bodies and their fire the only barrier between life and death. Every night was a test. Every morning was proof that somehow, against the weight of the ice, they had endured another day. This was humanity at its most vulnerable, but also at its most determined. Though our species had been reduced to a mere remnant, those remnants carried resilience, memory, and the stubborn will to survive. From them, the story of all who came after would be written. Fragile as they were, they refused to vanish. And in their struggle they preserved the possibility of everything humanity would one day become. In the frozen world where every breath stung the lungs, fire was more than a discovery. It was survival itself. The mastery of flame transformed fragile groups of humans into a species with a chance to endure. Without fire, the cold would have taken them, the beasts would have torn them apart, and the nights would have swallowed them whole. But with fire there was warmth, there was protection, and there was hope. The glow of flames painted cave walls with flickering shadows, a dance of light that offered comfort against the vast darkness outside. Children huddled near the embers, their faces lit by a soft orange glow, their bodies shielded from the biting chill of endless winter winds. Around them, elders tended the flames, feeding them with precious scraps of wood, dried grass, or even dung when nothing else could be found. To let the fire die was unthinkable. It was a lifeline that had to be guarded at all costs. But fire did more than ward off the cold. It kept predators at bay. Creatures whose eyes gleamed in the darkness just beyond the glow. Saber-toothed cats lingered at the edges of campfires, unwilling to face the searing heat and sudden sparks. Wolves, bold and cunning, circled but rarely crossed into the circle of flame. For humans, this fragile barrier of light meant safety. It meant a night of rest rather than endless fear. Alongside fire came stone, shaped by clever hands into tools that cut, scraped, and pierced. Sharp flakes struck from flint could slice through hides or carve wood into spears. Hand axes split bones to reach the rich marrow within, a food too valuable to waste. These tools turned the weak into hunters, gave them the means to bring down prey far larger than themselves, and allowed them to prepare food that would otherwise be inedible. Fire softened meat, released nourishment, and made survival possible where raw flesh alone could not sustain. Around the fire, stories were born. Voices rose in rhythm with the crackle of burning wood. Tales of hunts, of spirits, of ancestors and mysteries of the world passed from one generation to the next. Fire was not only warmth and weapon. It was memory. It was identity. It was the spark that connected people to one another in a world that seemed determined to break them apart. This mastery of fire and stone was the foundation of everything to come. It was fragile, yes, always threatened by storm or scarcity, yet it gave humanity something no other creature possessed, the ability to reshape their destiny. In the glow of firelight, they found not just survival, but the first faint glimmer of hope that even in the darkest age, their story was not yet finished. In the age of ice, the world was shared with giants. Across the frozen plains moved creatures so vast and powerful that they seemed like shadows of another age. Woolly mammoths towered over the tundra, their shaggy coats swaying in the wind, tusks curving like great ivory scythes. They traveled in herds, their heavy steps shaking the earth, carving paths through the snow that smaller creatures followed. For humans, these beasts were both a blessing and a danger. One mammoth could feed an entire clan for weeks, but bringing it down demanded courage, strategy, and unity. A single misstep in the hunt could mean death beneath trampling feet or the sweep of a tusk. Beyond the mammoths lurked the predators. Saber-toothed cats moved like shadows, their long fangs glinting in the dim light. They were ambush hunters, built for sudden strikes, and even the great mammoths feared them when they prowled alone or in pairs. For human clans, the threat was constant. A child who wandered too far from the fire, a hunter separated from his group, might vanish into the claws of these silent killers. Dire wolves hunted in packs, larger and stronger than their modern descendants. Their howls carried across the frozen night, a reminder that danger was never far away. Not all giants were predators. Great ground sloths, towering on hind legs, stripped bark from trees with claws longer than a man's arm. Slow and ponderous, they seemed less threatening, yet their sheer size made them formidable. A strike from such claws could crush bones, and their hides were tough as armor. To early humans, they were walking fortresses of meat, difficult to bring down but worth the effort if hunger pressed too sharply. The Ice Age world was a place where humans were never the masters, but always the survivors, watching, waiting, and learning the movements of beasts far stronger than themselves. They observed the herds, noted the trails, and studied the weaknesses of the giants around them. Fire and stone gave them a small advantage, but what truly kept them alive was the ability to think, to plan, to turn the strength of many against the power of one. To live among such giants was to walk in constant shadow. Every hunt carried risk, every journey meant facing creatures that dwarfed them. Yet from those dangers came the chance of survival. Mammoth hides became shelter, bones became weapons, meat became life itself. The giants ruled the land, but fragile as they were, humans found ways to endure in their presence. It was a dangerous balance, a delicate dance between predator, prey, and survivor, where the smallest of species began to prove its place in a world of giants. Modern science has uncovered a truth more haunting than any legend. Hidden within the strands of our DNA lies the memory of a time when humanity nearly vanished. Genetic evidence shows that long ago, our species passed through what is known as a bottleneck, a narrowing so severe that fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals carried the future of all humankind. Imagine it, the vast world stretching icy and indifferent, and only a remnant of our kind struggling to survive, each life holding the weight of generations yet unborn. This bottleneck was not just numbers written on a page. It was hunger gnawing at bones. It was infants born too weak to endure the cold. It was clans extinguished by storms, predators, or the endless march of glaciers. Each death reduced our chances. Each famine cut the thread of survival thinner. The margin between continuation and extinction was razor sharp, and no one living then could have known how close the species came to ending. The world was vast, but the people were scattered, isolated into small groups separated by mountains, rivers, and oceans of ice. Communication across distances was rare, if not impossible. A clan lost to famine left no trace but bones buried in frozen soil. Yet somewhere, in pockets of habitable land, humans clung to survival. They hunted along coasts, they followed herds, they fished in rivers that still flowed beneath sheets of frost. Their ingenuity, fragile though it was, became the thin line that separated humanity from oblivion. Our DNA still carries the marks of this narrowing. The lack of genetic diversity we see today is a reminder of how small the foundation of our species once became. From that small pool, every language, every culture, every invention, and every dream would one day arise. The world we know now, with its billions of people, traces back to that tiny spark in the dark age of ice. The bottleneck was more than a trial of survival. It was a moment that defined us. Other species, strong and well adapted, vanished when climates shifted, when food disappeared, or when predators grew too fierce. Yet humans, weak in body and few in number, endured. They endured because they adapted, because they cooperated, because they refused to surrender to the cold silence of extinction. In that narrow passage through time, when our future balanced on the edge of nothingness, the essence of humanity was forged. From fewer than 10,000, the story of us all continued, fragile as a flame, yet strong enough to outlast the ice. The story of humanity is the story of movement. Even in the harshest winters of the Ice Age, our ancestors did not remain still. They walked, they followed, they sought out new lands where food and shelter might be found. Paths were carved not with maps or markers, but with footprints pressed into snow, with memories passed from elders to children, with the instinct to follow the herds that offered life. From their cradle in Africa, small bands began to push outward. Climate shifts opened corridors of grassland and then closed them again with advancing ice. The world was in constant motion, and to survive, humans had to move with it. Across the Sinai and along the coasts of the Red Sea, they searched for fish and shellfish to sustain them. Some wandered into the Levant, finding temporary havens in caves that still bear the smoke stains of their fires. Each step was cautious, each journey uncertain. The further they went, the stranger the world became. In Eurasia they encountered vast plains swept by icy winds, home to creatures they had never seen before. Herds of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses grazed where grasses still grew. Reindeer migrated in endless streams, and human bands learned to shadow them, to anticipate their routes, to strike when hunger pressed hardest. Ice sheets loomed over the northern horizon, walls of white that seemed immovable and eternal. Yet along their edges, rivers still flowed, valleys still bloomed in brief summers, and their humanity found places to endure. Some groups pressed eastward, reaching as far as the steppes of Central Asia. Others remained near coasts, where tides offered fish even when the land turned barren. Each path taken was a gamble, but staying behind was often no less dangerous. The migrations were not swift. Generations passed as families moved a little further, settled for a time, then moved again when the land grew harsh. Children were born on the move, grew into hunters and gatherers, and carried the knowledge of their parents into new frontiers. The spread was slow, but steady, and with every step humanity learned new ways to survive in environments they had never known before. These paths across the ice were more than routes of necessity. They were the beginnings of humanity's global journey, the first threads of a web that would one day span the entire Earth. Every step taken by those small bands, every fire lit in a new land, every footprint pressed into frozen ground was part of a larger story. It was the story of a species refusing to remain confined, reaching out into the unknown, and adapting, step by step, to a world both hostile and full of promise. As our ancestors moved across new lands, they soon discovered they were not alone. The world was not empty, and the human story was never ours alone to tell. Waiting in the cold valleys of Europe were the Neanderthals, sturdy and strong, with bodies built for survival in the chill of the Ice Age. Farther east, in caves hidden in the vastness of Asia, lived the Denisovans, a people known to us only through fragments of bone and the silent record of their DNA. These were not strangers in the truest sense, but cousins, sharing a common origin deep in the past. The encounters were complex. At times, they were rivals. Neanderthals hunted the same game, sought shelter in the same caves, and fought for the same resources. They were skilled hunters, their tools finely made, their societies capable and resilient. For tens of thousands of years, they held their ground against the challenges of the Ice Age. Yet they also met us in other ways. Evidence shows that humans and Neanderthals interbred, leaving traces of their lineage in our blood today. The same is true of the Denisovans. Their presence endures in the genes of people across Asia and the Pacific. The legacy of these encounters lives within us, carried silently across millennia. But the question remains: why did only one lineage endure? Neanderthals were not simple or inferior. They created art, buried their dead, and adapted to a world as harsh as ours. The Denisovans, though shadowy in the record, clearly thrived in places that demanded strength and resourcefulness. Yet their numbers dwindled as ours grew, until their voices faded from the earth. Perhaps the answer lies not in strength of body, but in flexibility of mind and community. Our ancestors formed wider networks, traveled further, and shared knowledge across greater distances. They adapted quickly to changing environments, shifting diets, and new tools. While Neanderthals tended to remain in smaller, more isolated groups, humans built connections that stretched across landscapes. These ties created resilience, ensuring that no single famine or disaster could extinguish them entirely. The encounters with other humans shaped us as much as they defined our differences. We fought with them, lived beside them, and at times joined them in kinship. Though their separate identities vanished, they did not disappear entirely. A part of them walks within us still, carried in our blood, in our memories written into genes, a quiet reminder that we were never alone in this world. The survival of one lineage was not only the loss of others, but also the merging of stories, woven together into the long thread of humanity that continues today. Hunger was the constant shadow of the Ice Age. It pressed against every clan, gnawed at every child, and stalked even the strongest hunters. There was never enough food, never enough warmth, never enough certainty that tomorrow would bring survival. Yet from this desperation came invention. Necessity forced fragile humans to imagine new ways to endure, and in doing so, they began to shape tools and ideas that tipped the balance between life and death. One of the quiet revolutions was the making of clothing. Animal hides had long been used for warmth, but loose skins could only shield so much. Then came the creation of bone needles, carefully carved and sharpened, their eyes drilled with painstaking effort. With these simple tools, people stitched hides together, shaping them into garments that clung to the body and sealed against the cold. The difference was profound. Where once the wind cut through, now humans carried warmth with them, able to move further, hunt longer, and survive in lands once thought too brutal. Shelter, too, became an arena of innovation. In treeless plains where wood was scarce, mammoth bones rose into frames for huts. Enormous skulls formed walls, tusks arched into entrances, ribs and leg bones were lashed together and draped with hides. These shelters stood against the screaming winds and the biting frost, offering protection that simple lean-tos never could. Inside, fires burned, smoke curling upward through carefully crafted vents, while families slept huddled beneath furs, alive because of ingenuity born from hunger. Hunting also changed. Spears grew sharper, tipped with flint points perfected through generations of trial. Some bands learned to drive herds into natural traps, cliffs or bogs where panic turned strength into vulnerability. Cooperation deepened. No single hunter could bring down a mammoth, but together, with planning and courage, they could turn the might of many against the power of one. These strategies demanded foresight, communication, and unity, qualities that would carry humanity far beyond this frozen age. Hunger never vanished, but it shaped resilience. Each innovation was more than a tool. It was a promise that people could overcome the cruelty of their world. Bone needles, shelters of mammoth bones, new ways to hunt. These were the quiet victories that allowed fragile clans to outlast storms, predators, and famine. In desperation, they discovered creativity. And in creativity, they found the means to survive when survival seemed impossible. Hunger was their enemy, but it was also the fire that forged their ingenuity, ensuring that the human story would continue through the ice. 74,000 years ago, the earth itself seemed to turn against humanity. In what is now Indonesia, Mount Toba erupted with a fury unlike anything witnessed in human history. The explosion tore through the sky, releasing ash and smoke into the atmosphere in such vast amounts that the sun itself dimmed. For weeks the eruption raged, blanketing the land in molten rock and choking clouds. When it ended, the world was changed. Ash spread across continents, carried on the winds until it fell like gray snow thousands of miles away. The skies darkened, filtering sunlight into a pale, lifeless glow. Temperatures dropped, and the climate, already gripped by ice, plunged deeper into chaos. Crops withered where people had begun to gather plants. Grasses failed to grow for the herds. Lakes and rivers cooled, altering the patterns of fish and birds. It was as though the very rhythm of life had been shattered. For fragile human clans already pressed to the edge, this was disaster upon disaster. Famine grew sharper. Hunting became even more uncertain as herds scattered or perished. The cold intensified, and storms battered the land with unrelenting force. Entire groups vanished, leaving behind only stone tools buried beneath layers of ash. The bottleneck of humanity may have narrowed even further during these years, survival balanced on a knife's edge. Yet even in the shadow of Toba's fury, some endured. Along coasts, where the sea still offered fish and shellfish, bands of humans scraped together life. In valleys, sheltered from the worst of the ash, pockets of green remained, fragile oases where plants could still grow. Families clung to fire as their shield against both cold and darkness, guarding embers through wind and storm as though guarding the very soul of their people. The eruption was a trial that could have ended the story of humankind, but instead, it revealed the depth of resilience hidden within us. Those who endured did so through cooperation, through the careful sharing of food, through innovation that turned scarcity into survival. They adapted once again, as they had always done, to a world reshaped by forces beyond comprehension. The Toba catastrophe reminds us that humanity has never been safe from nature's fury, yet it also shows that even when the sky itself darkened and the earth burned, a few fragile sparks of life refused to be extinguished. Out of ash and ice, the story of humanity carried on, scarred but unbroken, proving once more that survival is written into the very core of what it means to be human. In the endless cold of the Ice Age, survival was not only a matter of food and shelter, it was also a matter of meaning. Around the flickering glow of fire, as winds howled beyond the fragile walls of hides and bone, our ancestors began to weave something new into the human story. They discovered the power of words, of symbols, of songs that carried memory and bound people together in ways stronger than any spear. Language was born not in an instant, but in whispers and gestures that grew into shared sounds. A hunter could signal danger with more than a glance. A mother could soothe her child with more than touch. Around the fire, words formed bridges between minds, carrying ideas across the silence. With language, people could plan hunts, recall distant places, and pass on lessons too important to be forgotten. Knowledge no longer perished with the individual but lived within the group, stretching across generations. From words came stories. Shadows danced upon cave walls as elders spoke of the spirits of the hunt, of ancestors watching from beyond, of the mysteries of fire and sky. These stories were not idle tales but threads of survival, teaching children when to follow the herds, when to fear the ice, when to trust the circle of fire. Myths gave shape to a world that often seemed hostile and unknowable. They offered comfort in the face of storms and death, a reminder that life had purpose even when every day was a struggle. Songs rose with the crackle of flames, voices joining in rhythm, perhaps first as chants that matched the beating of drums or the striking of stones. In song, breath became unity, many voices blending into one. The sound carried warmth that no fire could give, binding the group in shared identity. Where hunger divided, song united. Where fear silenced, story gave voice. Symbolic thought reached beyond language and music. Marks appeared on cave walls, painted in ochre and charcoal. Hands were pressed against stone, leaving imprints that whispered across millennia. We were here, we endured. These were not just decorations. They were affirmations of existence, sparks of identity in a vast and indifferent world. The birth of story, of song, of shared imagination was as crucial as any tool carved from stone. It gave humans a reason to endure when survival seemed impossible. Fire gave warmth to the body, but myth gave warmth to the spirit. Around the flames, humanity became more than fragile survivors. They became storytellers, singers, dreamers, a people bound not only by blood, but by the shared belief that their lives, however small against the ice, carried meaning worth remembering. Starvation was the shadow that never lifted in the age of ice. It haunted every clan, no matter how skilled their hunters or how carefully they guarded their fires. Archaeological evidence tells the story in silence, etched into bones and teeth that still bear the scars of hunger. Children whose growth was stunted, adults whose bodies showed signs of malnutrition, entire groups who left behind nothing but shallow graves. The fight for survival was never guaranteed, and often it was lost. Famine could arrive swiftly, when herds shifted their paths, or when storms buried the land in snow too deep to cross. It could creep slowly, as food stores dwindled and the winter dragged on longer than expected. Hunters returned with empty hands, and families faced nights where even firelight could not drive away the gnawing ache in their stomachs. Parents gave the last scraps to their children, but even sacrifice was not always enough. Yet the same evidence also tells us of endurance. People learned to scrape by on what the land still offered. Roots were dug from frozen soil with sharpened sticks, bitter but nourishing enough to sustain. Bones of animals, long since picked clean of meat, were cracked open for the marrow inside, a rich source of fat that could mean the difference between life and death. Along coasts and rivers, shellfish became a lifeline, gathered in baskets, roasted over fire, and eaten in the face of scarcity. These humble foods, overlooked in times of plenty, became treasures in the edge of famine. Survival often depended on adaptability. Those who clung only to the great hunts risked ruin when prey vanished. Those who broadened their diets, who searched for plants, roots, insects, and fish, stood a better chance of enduring. The ingenuity of humans was not only in crafting tools but in discovering possibilities where others saw nothing. Hunger pressed them to experiment, to taste, to remember, and to teach. Still, famine left deep marks on the human story. It carved fear into memory, shaping myths and rituals around scarcity and abundance. It forced cooperation, for no one could withstand the cold and hunger alone. Bands that shared, that pooled resources, that cared for their weakest, were the ones more likely to endure. The edge of starvation was a cruel place, but it was also where resilience was born. From the marrow cracked out of bones, from the bitter roots dug from frozen ground, from the humble shellfish pried from the sea, humanity learned to survive not only in times of plenty, but in the harshest seasons of want. It was in famine, as much as in fire or stone, that the endurance of our species was forged. When the land grew harsh and the great herds wandered beyond reach, the sea became a lifeline. Along coasts, rivers, and estuaries, small human bands discovered that the tides offered what the frozen plains could not. Shellfish clung to rocks, fish swam in schools, and seabirds nested on cliffs. In a world where hunger was constant, the waters promised nourishment that could be gathered without the long uncertainty of the hunt. Archaeological traces tell this story in piles of shells, known as middens, left behind by countless meals. These heaps grew over generations, silent records of survival. Clamshells, oyster shells, mussel shells, all testifying to the patient work of hands prying them open and fires roasting them for food. What might seem meager in times of plenty became salvation when winters dragged on and plains lay barren. Humans grew more skillful at drawing life from the waters. Fish traps of stone and woven reeds reveal their ingenuity. Set along tidal channels, these traps captured fish with the turning of the tide, turning the rhythms of the sea into steady harvests. Spears tipped with bone and barbed points allowed the catching of salmon and river fish. Nets, simple at first and refined over time, transformed rivers and shallow bays into reliable larders. The coast also offered more than food. It gave safety when inland travel grew perilous. Cliffs and caves facing the sea provided shelter, their stone walls protecting from wind and predators. Driftwood washed ashore to feed fires. Even seaweed became useful, eaten in small amounts or used to wrap and store food. The shoreline became not only a place of survival but a place of adaptation, shaping new ways of living. The sea also forged memory and meaning. People who depended on its gifts carried songs and stories of the tides. The rhythm of waves became part of their sense of time, the moon above a silent guide to the coming and going of waters. What they learned by the sea was passed down, ensuring that even in famine, some knowledge of survival always endured. Yet the sea was not always gentle. Storms could strip the coast bare, drown traps, and sweep away shelters. Saltwater was unforgiving, and those who relied on it needed courage as much as skill. But again and again, when the world seemed determined to erase humanity, the waters opened their hand and offered enough to carry fragile lives forward. The sea became more than a refuge. It was a teacher, a partner, and a constant reminder that survival required not just strength, but the wisdom to seek life in places once overlooked. Along its shores, humanity found resilience, and in its depths, the spark of endurance was kept alive. The ice demanded more than strength. It demanded unity. Alone, a person could not bring down a mammoth, could not face the reindeer herds that thundered across the plains, could not carry enough food back to camp to keep even a single family alive through the long winter. But together, in carefully woven bonds of trust, small bands of humans discovered the power of cooperation. Hunting the great beasts of the Ice Age was not simply a matter of courage. It was a lesson in patience, strategy, and the unspoken rhythm of many working as one. To face a mammoth, hunters fanned out in silent arcs, driving the animal toward waiting spears. They dug pits, set traps, and coordinated every movement with precision. One mistake could mean death, but a successful hunt meant survival for weeks. The meat, the fat, the hides, the bones. Every part of the animal carried value, and every member of the group shared in the reward. Reindeer, though smaller, required no less skill. Their herds moved swiftly across the icy plains, and hunters learned to read their paths, predicting where they would cross rivers or bottleneck in narrow valleys. Spears were cast in unison, and nets stretched across their routes brought them down. What one could not do, many together could. Around these hunts, new bonds were forged. People learned to depend not just on close kin, but on wider circles of allies. Cooperation meant survival, and cooperation reshaped humanity. Around the fire, food was divided, not hoarded. Tasks were shared. The strong protected the weak, and the weak contributed in ways that strength alone could not, through knowledge, through memory, through teaching. Survival became not the triumph of one, but the triumph of many. This spirit of unity left traces in more than bones and tools. It shaped minds. Language grew richer as people needed to coordinate complex actions. Gestures, signals, and words became sharper, clearer, more necessary. Trust deepened, for betrayal in such conditions meant ruin, while loyalty meant life. The lessons of the ice were harsh, but they forged resilience. The cold carved away selfishness, leaving in its place networks of care and shared struggle. Those who learned to stand together endured. Those who did not vanished into the silence of the frozen world. From the hunt for mammoth and reindeer, humanity carried forward not just food and shelter, but a new way of being. In the shadow of the ice, individuals became communities, and communities became the seed of a future that no storm could erase. When the world was locked in ice, land and prey were precious beyond measure. Small bands of humans roamed vast territories, yet often their paths crossed, and with each meeting came both danger and opportunity. Competition for hunting grounds, for rivers rich in fish, for caves that offered shelter, sometimes ended in blood. Evidence carved into ancient bones tells of spear wounds, skull fractures, and the scars of violence. Conflict was not unknown to our ancestors. It was part of the struggle to endure in a world that gave little freely. But the story is not only of battle. Alongside the marks of violence lie signs of contact, of exchange, of cautious alliance. When groups met, they measured one another, weighing the risk of conflict against the possibility of cooperation. A stranger might be an enemy, but they might also bring new tools, new songs, new ways of survival. Some encounters led to raids, with food stolen and lives taken. Yet others led to trade. Obsidian from distant mountains traveled across lands where it did not exist. Shells from the sea found their way far inland, carried by hands that passed them from one group to the next. These exchanges reveal more than survival. They reveal the beginnings of networks, fragile but growing, linking scattered bands across the ice. The tension between rivalry and alliance shaped the course of humanity. Violence may have thinned the numbers of some groups, but the sharing of knowledge and goods strengthened others. A bone needle discovered in one camp could spark imitation in another. A story told by a wandering band might carry warnings of storms, or lessons of where the herds would pass. Even in a time when scarcity bred mistrust, the impulse to connect, to give and receive, was present. Archaeological remains show both sides of this truth. Skulls with healed wounds prove that even after violence, life continued, and sometimes forgiveness or coexistence followed. Burials with ornaments from distant lands suggest that peace could endure long enough for families to blend and alliances to be sealed. Human groups were never entirely enemies, nor entirely friends. They lived in the shifting balance between fear and hope, survival and cooperation. When worlds collided, the outcome was uncertain. Spears might be raised, or hands might reach to share. The Ice Age tested not only human endurance but human choice, and from those choices, whether to fight, to trade, or to join, emerged the fragile threads of connection that would one day weave humanity into something larger than scattered bands in a frozen world. The world began to change. Slowly at first, almost unnoticeably, the endless grip of winter loosened. Glaciers that had once seemed eternal began to retreat, inch by inch, their frozen walls melting into rivers that carved new paths across the land. Valleys buried for generations under sheets of ice emerged again, and with them, the promise of new life. For humans who had known only cold and scarcity, this thaw was the beginning of a turning point. The climate shifted, bringing with it the return of plants and animals long absent from the frozen plains. Grasses spread across open lands, followed by herds of grazing animals that grew in number and variety. Where once only mammoths and reindeer dominated, new species appeared, offering new sources of food and new challenges for the hunt. Rivers, swollen with meltwater, teemed with fish. Forests began to creep back, offering wood for fires and tools, fruits and nuts for gathering. The earth, long silent under ice, stirred with abundance once more. Humans seized the opportunities with a vigor born of centuries of hardship. Camps moved into new regions, following the retreat of ice and the spread of green. The skills honed in desperate times, cooperation, tool-making, the sharing of knowledge now found greater reward. Spears and arrows brought down game in lands where animals thrived in growing numbers. Fire once used to warm the cold was turned to clearing brush, shaping landscapes in small but deliberate ways. The thaw also reshaped the patterns of human life. With food more plentiful, groups grew in size. Larger communities could gather without constant fear of famine. Children had better chances of surviving, and with each new generation, knowledge deepened. Traditions, stories, and skills spread more widely, weaving continuity between past struggles and future hopes. Yet this turning point was not without challenge. As glaciers melted, rivers sometimes flooded, reshaping the land in sudden and violent ways. Forests brought predators alongside prey. Old hunting grounds disappeared beneath rising waters. To thrive in this new world, humans had to remain as adaptable as ever, meeting each shift with resilience. Still, The retreat of the ice marked a threshold. For the first time in countless generations, survival was no longer only about enduring the cold. It became about exploring, expanding, and imagining possibilities beyond the next hunt or the next fire. The world was changing, and so were the people who walked upon it. The thaw carried with it not only warmth but the promise of a future in which humanity would do more than survive. It would begin to grow. The thaw of the world brought more than warmer winds and fertile lands. It stirred something within the human spirit that had long waited in silence. For countless generations, every moment had been consumed by survival. Finding food, keeping fires lit, protecting children from the cold and predators. But as the ice retreated and life grew less fragile, a new hunger rose, one not of the body, but of the mind. It was the hunger to create, to imagine, to give form to thoughts that reached beyond the daily struggle to endure. Deep within the caves of Europe, this hunger found its expression. On the walls of Lascaux and Chauvet, in flickering firelight, humans painted visions of their world. Great bison charged across stone, horses leapt in herds, mammoths stood tall in ochre and charcoal. These were not idle drawings. They were acts of meaning. Each line, each color, spoke of a bond between people and the life around them. The animals were not only prey, they were spirits of power, companions in survival, beings worthy of reverence. The caves became sanctuaries of imagination. Torches carried light into their depths, illuminating shapes that transformed bare stone into living worlds. Hands left their marks in outlines of red and black, as if to say, "We were here, we endure." Symbols emerged, dots, lines, and signs whose meanings we may never fully know, but which carried messages from one mind to another across the gulf of time. In these acts, humanity stepped into a realm that was more than physical survival. It entered the realm of culture. Art was not limited to caves. Small carvings in bone and ivory depicted animals, people, and forms of beauty. Figures of women, rounded and powerful, celebrated fertility and life in a world where birth itself was fragile. Beads made from shells and stones were strung into necklaces, transforming simple adornment into a statement of identity. Music, too, was born. Flutes carved from bird bone and mammoth ivory released melodies that echoed through valleys, carrying joy, ritual, and connection. This flowering of imagination changed how humans saw themselves. Around fires, stories grew richer, shaped by the same creativity that painted the cave walls. Myths were born, weaving explanations for the mysteries of life and death, storm and star, beast and shadow. These stories bound communities together, giving shared purpose and shared memory. Where once survival alone defined existence, now meaning and beauty became part of the human journey. The rise of culture also strengthened resilience. Songs carried knowledge of migration routes and seasons. Carvings preserved memories of animals and landscapes. Rituals ensured cooperation and reinforced unity. Creativity was not only expression, it was survival made stronger through imagination. In this turning of the age, humans were no longer creatures clinging to life in the ice. They became storytellers, dreamers, makers of symbols. They claimed not just the land, but the unseen worlds of thought and spirit. The caves of Lascaux and Chauvet stand as testaments to that transformation, their walls still whispering across tens of thousands of years. In their echoes lies the proof that once survival gave space for imagination. Humanity began to rise into something greater than it had ever been before. The ice loosened its grip, and slowly, the human story began to change. Populations that had once dwindled to a perilous few thousand started to grow again. Families welcomed more children who survived beyond their early years, and bands that had been scattered found room to expand. Yet the recovery was fragile, stretched thin across landscapes, still reshaping themselves after centuries of cold. Each life was precious, each new birth a victory against the memory of near extinction. Archaeologists and geneticists, working with the traces left behind, tell us of this narrow escape. The evidence lies within us even now, written in the code of our genes. All people alive today carry the signature of that bottleneck, a time when our numbers were so few that the diversity of our species was pared down to a razor's edge. Many ancient lineages vanished, never to return, leaving behind only echoes in fragments of DNA. The scars of that age are a silent reminder of how close we came to disappearing. For the humans who lived through it, the struggle was constant. The gradual rebound of population did not mean abundance. Every child still had to be guarded against disease, hunger, and the bite of cold. Every group still faced the risk of being erased by famine, predators, or conflict. Growth came not in leaps, but in careful steps, built upon the fragile foundations of cooperation, ingenuity, and the fragile luck of survival. The world itself was changing around them. Glaciers continued to retreat, revealing valleys where rivers ran strong and plains where herds multiplied. This slow expansion of habitable land gave room for humans to spread further, filling spaces that had long been closed by ice. Migration was both necessity and opportunity, scattering people into new regions where they adapted to unfamiliar challenges. Each step outward carried the story of recovery, fragile but determined. Still, the shadow of loss remained. The bottleneck meant that humanity carried forward a thinner pool of genetic variation than it once had. While this cannot be seen in faces or in daily life, it shaped the legacy of our species in ways we still uncover. It is as though all of humanity had walked a narrow bridge, barely wide enough to hold, and those who made it across became the ancestors of everyone alive today. The fragile recovery was not just a matter of numbers, it was also a matter of spirit. Surviving such trials imprinted a deep resilience upon those early communities. They had faced a world that seemed determined to erase them, and yet they endured. The knowledge of closeness to extinction lingered in their traditions, in their reverence for life, in their cautious steps toward the future. From a handful of survivors, humanity began its long climb back. Slowly, the bands became tribes, the tribes grew into larger networks, and the spark of culture began to spread across continents. The recovery was fragile, but it was enough. Enough to ensure that humanity did not vanish into silence, but carried forward into the unfolding story of the ages to come. Though Neanderthals and Denisovans no longer walk the earth, their presence has not vanished completely. They live on within us, not as separate tribes on the frozen plains, but as fragments of memory carried in our very blood. Modern science has uncovered what the ancients themselves could not have known that long ago. When our ancestors met these close cousins, they did not only compete, they also mingled, sharing more than land and resources. They shared life itself, and in doing so left us with traces of their being. Every person alive today who is descended from those ancient journeys out of Africa carries within them a small part of Neanderthal DNA. In some parts of the world, fragments of Denisovan DNA endure as well, rarer, but no less significant. These genetic whispers are reminders that humanity's story was never only about us alone. It was about encounters, crossings, and the fragile blending of lineages that shaped what we would become. The evidence shows that these exchanges were not rare accidents. For generations, humans and Neanderthals lived side by side in parts of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans left their mark across Asia and into the Pacific. Some unions were fleeting, perhaps born of chance, but others may have formed bonds of family and kinship. Their children carried the legacy of both worlds, and through them, the blood of the others entered our own. Though Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared as distinct peoples, their gifts remain etched into us. Some genes influence our immune systems, helping us resist diseases that once threatened survival. Others affect how our bodies respond to climate, altitude, or even how our skin and hair adapted to different environments. In ways subtle and profound, the echoes of the others shaped the resilience of our kind. Yet, their disappearance still casts a long shadow. We do not know the full reasons why they vanished while we endured. Climate change, dwindling numbers, and competition with us likely played their roles. But in their extinction and our survival, a paradox remains. Though they are gone, they are also still here, woven invisibly into every breath we take. Their story is not entirely separate from ours. It lives on in the rhythm of our hearts, in the fragments of their code that help make us who we are. When we look back at the Ice Age, it is easy to see only survival, conflict, and loss. But hidden within that story is connection, intimacy, and the mingling of destinies. Neanderthals and Denisovans did not simply fade into the silence of the past. They became part of us, inseparable from the journey of humanity. The echoes of the others are not ghosts to be mourned. They are threads in the tapestry of what it means to be human. Their voices are still within us, not in words or songs, but in the very substance of our being. In every step forward, we carry them with us, silent companions from a vanished world who, in a way, never truly disappeared. The long winter had tested humanity to its limits. But once the ice began to retreat and the world opened, our ancestors stepped forward with a determination that reshaped the earth itself. What had once been a fight simply to endure became the beginning of an expansion unlike anything seen before. Small bands that had survived on the edge of extinction now spread outward, crossing rivers, climbing mountains, and venturing into lands no human had walked before. In Europe, people moved deeper into valleys once sealed by glaciers. Forests grew thick where ice had dominated, and humans adapted quickly, hunting red deer and wild boar, fishing rivers rich with salmon, and gathering the first shoots of spring. In Asia, they pushed across steppes and deserts, carrying with them fire, tools, and stories. In time, some reached the high plateaus of Tibet and the Himalayas, learning to breathe in the thin air, their bodies adapting to altitudes that had once been unthinkable. Farther still, they ventured to the great island of Australia, crossing seas with simple rafts and boats. There, they found a land filled with strange and powerful creatures, giant kangaroos, massive flightless birds, marsupial lions. With fire and skill, they adapted once more, hunting what they could and altering the land itself. Firesticks turned dense forests into grasslands, reshaping ecosystems and leaving human fingerprints across a vast continent. In time, humans reached the Americas, perhaps by following herds across land bridges of ice, or by skirting coastlines in small vessels. However they came, their arrival transformed the land. They encountered mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths, and in each encounter the balance tipped. Some creatures could withstand the cleverness of human hunters, but many could not. As people spread, ecosystems shifted, predators dwindled, and species that had thrived for millennia disappeared. This expansion was not only conquest, it was also creativity. Each new land demanded new answers. In the frozen north, humans built shelters of snow and bone, wore furs sewn tight against the cold, and learned to track seals across endless ice. In the tropics, they wove nets, gathered fruits, and shaped tools for fishing and climbing. Every step forward was a lesson in adaptation, and every adaptation carried humanity further still. Yet with each new territory claimed, the world grew smaller for other creatures. Wolves, lions, and great bears found themselves in competition with hunters who could outthink and outlast them. The balance of power shifted, and for the first time, no region of the earth was untouched by human hands. From survival to expansion, humanity had crossed a threshold. What had once been a fragile species clinging to life on the edge of extinction had become a force capable of reshaping entire continents. The journey was not yet complete, but its direction was clear. The spread of people across the earth marked the dawn of something new, the beginning of humanity, as the dominant presence in every corner of the world. Even as humanity flourishes, the shadow of what almost happened never disappears. Our ancestors carried with them not only their tools, their stories, and their fire, but also the memory of how close they came to vanishing. It was not written in words at first, but in the quiet knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The earth had once grown cold. The skies had once darkened with ash. Hunger had hollowed bodies, and silence had claimed entire groups. Only a thread of life had endured, and from that thread, all of us were born. As people spread across continents and built new ways of living, that memory remained, hidden deep in blood and bone. The genetic bottleneck left its mark, a reminder that every person alive today is descended from a small handful of survivors who weathered the storm. We are many now, but once we were few, and that truth lingers like a scar beneath the skin. Around fires, stories turned that memory into myth. Tales of floods and great winters, of skies falling and beasts vanishing, carried echoes of real catastrophes. Even when the details shifted, the heart of the stories was the same. The world can break, and only through unity, cunning, and endurance do we survive. They were warnings carved into the imagination, lessons wrapped in story to ensure that the memory of fragility was never forgotten. In time, humans learned to build more than shelters and tools. They built cultures, languages, and faiths. They painted on cave walls, carved figures from bone, and sang songs that carried across generations. Each creation was more than expression. It was a declaration that life had not been extinguished, that despite the odds, humanity remained. The very act of art was an answer to extinction. We endure, we remember, we imagine. But survival also came with responsibility. As humans reshaped ecosystems, hunted great animals, and spread across the globe, the lessons of the past lingered. Nature was powerful, unpredictable, and capable of erasing everything. This awareness created a tension that remains within us even now. We build, we grow, we flourish, but deep down, we know how fragile it all island. The near extinction of humanity shaped who we became. It forged resilience in the face of disaster. It bound communities together through cooperation. It planted the seeds of imagination, language, and story. It carved humility into our beginnings, reminding us that survival was never guaranteed. That memory has traveled with us into every village, every city, every civilization that followed. And so, the story of humanity is not only the story of triumph, but also the story of how close we came to ending before we had even begun. We are the children of survivors. We are the inheritors of their endurance. Every breath we take carries the memory of that fragile thread that held when the world seemed determined to break it. From that memory comes a truth that defines us still. Humanity is fragile. Humanity is resilient. Humanity is shaped forever by the age when we nearly vanished. And it is that memory, both warning and guide, that continues to shape the path of who we are and who we may yet become.